Well, my classes started, of course, at 7 a.m. as they do every day, 7 days a week. And then they ended at 10 o'clock this morning because I had 3 appointments, and the 5 minutes I took to walk from my last appointment over here is the only 5 minutes in the day I've had a break. So it's been a busy day. I'm so sorry, though. I started introducing myself, but it dawns on me, I've heard a great deal about you, but we've never actually been introduced, and I've never given you a formal introduction, and that's rude. So allow me one now. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. My name, of course, is Anne Wager, Mrs. Wager. Not only your humble servant, but a teacher in the city, specifically a tutoress, a teacher of young children. But more particularly, I, in this year of our Lord 1762, run the Williamsburg Bray School. I know it's been mentioned to you by the trustee of my school, Mr. Nicholas. Well, he's mentioned that you and he are friends. And so you've likely heard that my school is, well, it's the first official school for Negroes. Slaves, predominantly. 9 out of 10 of my students are slaves, most of them being around 6, 7 years old. But every 1 or 2 they are free. I teach, well, in terms of free families, the Ashby family of Williamsburg. I teach the Jones family. I teach the B. Ooh, I take that back. No, I mean, I teach the B family, but in Virginia, you must understand, by law, the status of a child is based on the mother, not the father. And therefore, as their father is free, but their mother is a slave, all of the children are slaves. I digress, though. Actually, this is sort of bringing me to my point, since Mr. Nicholas, our mutual friend and the trustee of my school, has mentioned that, well, the reason you ended up in conversation was that he told me you're all potentially looking to move to Williamsburg. Did I get that right? Good. Well, at least there's a reason for us talking. Otherwise, what the point? Never mind. But specifically, he mentioned that while you were talking, and while you were talking about moving to Williamsburg, he brought up the school he is trustee of, my school, the Bray School. And he said, what was the word he used? He was so polite about it. Have you ever met a person who's too polite to actually say what they're thinking? They find another way to word it? Yeah. What did he say? He said you were distressed. No. Curious. Curious, that's the word he used. Curious about my school for blacks. Since naturally, in Virginia, in this year of our Lord 1762, it has never been illegal to teach a black to read or write. I never said it was popular. We'd have more than 1 school in all of Virginia, if it were. But it's never been illegal. And that was what he said got your curiosity going, trying to understand the school, what I do, what I teach, why it's here. And he thought, well, what better person to talk to you than the woman who runs it 7 days a week? Which is exactly what I do. It's odd, though. I mentioned I've had a great deal of appointments today. I actually had one just prior to meeting with you down at Mrs. Campbell's Tavern. Are you familiar with her? She's a fellow businesswoman. Some of you have likely heard of her. She runs a very fine tavern just down past the Capitol building. And for the past several years has sent slaves to my school to be trained up so they might work in her tavern. And that walk, as I said, is about 5 minutes, so not too long. But it's a new year. And do some of you get more reflective at the beginning of a new year? I know I do. And so I was walking, and it's cold, and not quite cold enough that I'm uncomfortable, but enough that I'm thinking. And naturally, Mr. Nicholas told me that you all wanted to meet with me to talk about my school, and to talk about a school means that you talk about education. And it's that word, education. I don't like that word. Well, I like it and I dislike it for the same reason. Can I ask you a question? What is your name? Like, when you hear the word education, what is the first thing that comes to your mind off the top of your head? Learning. I like that. Madam, when you hear the word, first thing off the top of your head, what do you think of?
Learning.
Learning?
Academics.
Academics. What about the rest of you?
Knowledge.
Knowledge? What about you? I heard you say something, or one of you. No? Academics, knowledge, learning. What do you think? School? I like that. See, this is what's got me thinking. I asked 4 of you what you thought of the word. And with the exception of 2 of you, which in fact I've never seen when I've asked this question, you all came up with a different definition. Do you see the problem with the word? That's why I like it and dislike it. I like the word education because automatically, like when I asked you, you responded immediately. Truth be told, do you want to know how I answered that question before I became a teacher?
Sure.
I don't care. That was how I answered it. I don't care, get it done. And now as a teacher, I have a different response. Yet I am the same person, and not that many years have transpired. And that's what I've been thinking about. I like the word, because it means something to everybody. But that's also why I dislike the word. It means something different to everybody. Yet everyone assumes their definition must be the same as their neighbor's. They never actually ask your friend, do you have a good education? If you're looking at me thinking this is a stupid question, I can't really blame you. Who on earth in their right mind usually asks that question? Not many. And that's what I've been thinking about. Because the appointment that I mentioned with Mrs. Campbell just prior to you, I was dropping off books. Now, I know I'm a teacher. I love books. Not surprising that I love books. But I really do. In fact, the book I was dropping off, it was the spelling book I use in my classroom, Dixon's English Instructor. This is my personal copy, you must understand. Bound in Russia calf with gilt engraving, it cost me $25 of my salary for last year. Well, so when I say I like books, sir, I really mean it. No, the copy I was sending of this book to my students was in this size. Well, it's cheaper that way.
Yeah.
How many of you who are young students yourself often discover your resources are not as fine as those of your teachers? Am I wrong?
No.
So I was dropping off books. And my school is sponsored, so in order to drop off the books, I have to get permission from your friend, Mr. Nicholas. No book can leave my classroom without his consent. So I went to Mr. Nicholas and I asked, might I borrow some books for my current students so they continue to practice their spelling? They're 6, 7. And he said, of course you may. Truth be told, Mrs. Wager, I am most pleased you have asked to borrow the books, since we know the whole point of this school is to make more obedient Christian slaves. No, I apologize. I wasn't surprised by the response. He's always said that about the school, so I didn't really think about it. So I took the book, and I went to Mrs. Campbell's, and I dropped it off in London. The 3 students that are currently in my school are London, Aggie, and Shropshire. London's the oldest at 7. Do any of you have siblings, or had siblings that were 7 once in your life? But London's not like my siblings were. He's very quiet. Have you ever met a child that is the most quiet student in the class, but likely they're probably the smartest one? They don't actually tell you what they're thinking. That's London. In fact, in the 2 years I've taught him, he's never said more than 5 sentences to me. But today he did. He looked me direct in the face, and he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Wager. I'm excited for the book, because it means I can practice my spelling and my writing, and I can share it with all the other Negroes, all the other slaves on the property that can't go to your school." And it didn't surprise me. That actually is one of the reasons the school is funded, so I didn't really think very much about it. And then I went to Mrs. Campbell to let her know I dropped off the books. "Ah," says she, "I'm very pleased you've done so. For we know, you know at least, the whole reason I send my properties to your school, my slaves, is to make them more valuable if I'd like to sell them." It didn't surprise me, because that was the response from her I expected. But walking over here, then I started thinking about it. I had shown the exact same book, down to the binding, to all 3 of these people who I have known for many years. And not one of them could agree on what the point of using this book was. Do you see the problem? In fact, I think perhaps it's not why Mr. Nicholas wanted me to talk to you, but if you really want to understand how my school works, then you have to understand that everyone values education, but no one at the school can agree on it. And in fact, depending who you talk to, those who fund my school, those who send me most of my students, slave owners, and the slaves or the blacks themselves, I think they all have very different opinions on the point of it. In the first place, I mentioned I get funding from my school, yes. And some of you are students currently, and others teachers. Then you all likely understand the ramifications of not having enough funding, don't you? Not having enough books or supplies, or being expected to acquire things on your own terms and finances. In any case, I will say, at least in my situation, I do have some funding, and it comes naturally from the official church in Virginia. Oh, I'm sorry, if you're not from Virginia, I should be clear. In the year of our Lord 1762, All of the colonies, with the exception of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Rhode Island, all have official churches. They are a branch of the government. And as they are the branch of the government in which benevolent charity is extended, naturally they have a great deal of control over schooling. So my church, the Church of England, hardly surprising, has very clear principles on why they want my school run. The Bray School, my title, comes from the Bray Associates. The Bray Associates are the third largest charity in our official church. So the Church of England, and rather than digressing to this point, I can make the example with my spelling book. You've all used a spelling book before, have you not?
Mm-hmm.
Have you actually ever paid attention, though, to what you're being taught when you learn how to spell? I have. The Bray Associates and the Church of England pay for all of my books, the rent for my house, anything I need they pay for, which is why I use Dixon's English instruction. And of course, after the introduction, you start with, well, what do you start with when you start spelling? The alphabet. No, it's not a trick question. The alphabet. Basic consonants and vowels, and of course then basic words like parts of a house, things that you eat. But of course the first lesson after you get through the alphabet is a condensed version of the teaching of the Church of England. And it proceeds that way for the next 180 pages. They have a very clear idea of what they want taught at the school, and I well respect it being devoted to our official church. But when church or any person has influence over your school, they get to influence your policy. And naturally, the policy when it comes to the institution of slavery and our church is an old one, which is that they see them as completely compatible. In fact, the church, well, every minister I've ever met owns slaves outright. Most churches I know do too. And so therefore, they are not trying to disestablish the institution of slavery by teaching a slave to read or write. No. Training them to what they ought to believe. How many of you have met a 3 or a 4-year-old before? They're fairly gullible, aren't they? In the sense that you can tell them something, and if you are trusted, they likely believe you. That's why most of my students start at 3 or 4. Now, many of you mentioned have met a 7 or an 8-year-old, though, haven't you? A little less gullible, perhaps. By the time they get to 10, they're asking all sorts of questions between everything you say. It's interesting. I've never had a student older than the age of 10 at my school. I couldn't say direct it is because they ask too many questions, but one can infer. Now, that being said, why a school gets funded is not always why people use it. How many of you have mothers and fathers who have opinions on how you were taught? I'm assuming you all have mothers and fathers. And they naturally have opinions on what kind of marks you get, or how a teacher treats you, or where you are to go, correct? It's the same for my charges. Granted, it's not usually their parents I interact with. I often don't meet them. But those who own them. And I have to admit, as a member of the Church of England, I assumed that as the school was sponsored by the church, most people would send them for that pious reason. 2 years in, however, I've discovered it's often not a reason that people send students, or maybe not even a main reason at all. Well, we're in a city in Virginia, yes? Yes. And you all know, at least I hope you do, Williamsburg is a fine city, but as far as Virginia goes, it's the exception to the rule and not the rule. You all know that, don't you? Mm-hmm. How many cities are actually in Virginia currently? Does anyone know? By my mark, 4. You have Williamsburg, which is about 2,000 people. Norfolk, the largest city, which is about 7,000 people. Fredericksburg, if you really want to call it a city, might have 1,000. Might. And if we're being generous, we can call Alexandria a city, but it has 300 people. Most people live out on fields, plantations. But in a city, it is different. You are close-quartered, and with that comes the best of the best. The finest townhomes, the finest taverns. That's why we have over a dozen taverns here in the city. And with that, when you know that over half the population will be Negro, and most of them slave, comes a very different type of task for a slave. If you were to work in a tavern, managing accounts, stabling horses, perhaps dressing someone's hair, or dressing them to be prepared for a ball or assembly, that's quite specific and skilled now, isn't it? You have cooks, laundresses, waiting men, ladies' maid, anyone who is anyone anyone of quality has these tasks performed by a slave. And therefore I would look to you. Well, what is more useful than a cook? One who cannot read or one who can? What is more useful than a waiting man? One who can copy out letters from his master, or one who must hand the paper always to the master? That's, I think, why most people send me students. Slaves that are attached to cities must be taught to read and write, and in being taught to read and write, outside of anything they may get out of it, they're literally worth more money. That being said, we all were discussing that a school may be funded for a different reason than a parent or a patron may use it, and to that point, I would be disingenuous if I... Some of you I know are students. Do you always agree with what your parents tell you? Really, you have nothing to say to that. I can tell you're thinking, no, I don't. Do you think it's any different from my students? To assume that they always think the same thing as their masters and mistresses is something I would have thought 2 years ago when I started at the school, but let me tell you, I cannot definitively say why these Negro children, what they get out of the school. Ideally, it's to be more obedient, but I'm also not stupid. And in part, I will never know because, well, London is quiet because naturally he is a quiet child, but London is also property. He is a slave. If he were to say anything that I disliked in the classroom, I would not only report it to his master or mistress, he'd be pulled from the school. He's too smart to say anything. Do you understand? But every once in a while, you do get a student who, while they're smart enough not to say anything, they ask you just the right question that gets your mind thinking. And I had that happen actually this past week. That's, I think, why I've been thinking about this. I have another student in my class by the name of Hannah. And she's 7 years old, same age as London, but has no problem asking questions. All of the time. And we had just come back from Bruton, from Sunday service, and we had, in the service, been discussing Hebrews. Specifically, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14. It's a phrase I'm sure you're familiar with, in which it says, "Let all men live in peace and holiness, without which no man shall see God." Which, as far as Scripture goes, I've always felt that was a fairly obvious piece of Scripture. Hannah did not think so, though. We get back to the class, we're about to discuss Hebrews, and she shoots her hand up in the air, and only the way a 7-year-old can, and she goes, "Mrs. Wager, I don't like that, it doesn't make sense." "First," said I, "Hannah, what doesn't make sense?" She said, "What the minister said in church." I said, "Hannah, if you agree to calm down, you may explicate further, and I will do my best to answer your question. What is it about Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14 that does not make sense to you?" "Well," she says, again in the only way a 7-year-old can, "well, my master, the trustee of my school, has promised that I will be here the 3 years that is required. All of my students technically by rules are supposed to be there for 3 years, but I'm lucky to get most for about 12 months. He promised," she said, "that I will be here 3 years, enough so that I can learn the Testament and the Bible." But I was talking to London, and Aggie, and Shropshire from Mrs. Campbell's, and Mary, and Harry from Mr. Everard's, and they all said they're only going to be here 12 months, as soon as they can learn to read and spell, but before they can actually read the Bible. In light of that, Mrs. Wager, how is your school living in holiness? Right? Out of the mouth of a 7-year-old. And naturally, I answered as I ought. I said, "Hannah, you are a slave. It is not your place to question anyone else's." And she made that face that all 7-year-olds make when they're not happy with a response. They go. But it got me thinking. Hannah was taking the lessons I was giving her, and she was not being more obedient, and she was not doing it for value. She was asking questions. The kinds of questions that the students beyond the age of 10 might ask. And that's why I named them. And it made me think, honestly, if you want to understand how my school can function, then you have to know that as a teacher, I've heard everybody's opinions, I am put in the middle of them, and I have learned how to be a politician. want to know, didn't ever plan either on being a teacher. Not that I don't like teaching now, I do, it's just well, it's 16 years old. What 16-year-old wakes up and thinks, do you know what I'd like to do? Teach children 7 days a week starting at 7 a.m. Are any of you 16? Would you ever want to do that? I can't blame you, young lady. I didn't want to. But thinking about it now, I've also discovered sometimes the things, at least for me, the things I planned for myself at 16, they weren't always the things I ended up doing, but very often they were the things I needed to end up doing. I never planned on being a teacher. My husband died, I needed some income. I thought, well, I have a good enough education, I'll teach. But by God, I've gotten more meaning out of it than I expected. And so, if you want to understand how the school functions, you have to understand what I do. If Hannah had ever said what she had said outside of my classroom and word had gotten around, masters be unhappy, school shut down. If we don't at least try to make the masters use the school for the Christian principles in which it is designed, or highlight the ones that do, the Bray Associates become unhappy, the school shuts down, and if I don't meet a quota, in order to keep my funding, I have to have at least 30 students, otherwise I lose all of the money. If I don't teach at least 30 students, quality be damned. Then the school shuts down anyway. And yes, sir, I know I did. But I'm frustrated. I'm so angry. I am frustrated because I am exhausted and I am working 7 days a week and I get up at 7 a.m. to teach some children who ask me questions that I don't know how to answer, and I get paid a third less than a man. I'm sorry, I should not have directed that at you. It's not your fault. But are there any things that some of you ever care about? Are there things you're passionate about? And do those things sometimes drive you absolutely mad? Where you wake up in the morning, I wake up at 6 a.m. and I think, why on earth am I doing any of this? Who will care? It doesn't matter. And then I think about it again, and I think, no, I care. It matters to me. And that's the reality. Sometimes you do things like teach at a school like mine because you feel compelled to do it. And nothing could stop you. I digress, though. I apologize. I lost my temper and I was cross, and that was rude. And does anyone have the o'clock on them? What time is it? 1:50. Oh! I've been talking at you for 26 minutes? This is a bad habit with teachers. I start talking, and then I start talking about my school, and I'm very passionate about my school, and I don't stop talking. I digress. I apologize. First of all, that's rude. And secondly, I was told, at least by your friend, Mr. Nicholas, that you might have questions for me, and it would be disingenuous. Well, you've been so gracious to listen. The least I could do was answer whatever query you may have. I mean, they can be on my school or myself or, I don't know, my thoughts on the weather. But you've only to show you have a question by the raising of your hand. Yes, madam.
It's my understanding that it's illegal at this time to teach slaves to read and write. How did you get around that law?
No, madam, a point of clarification. I mentioned it briefly at the beginning, but the question was about legality. And I should be abundantly clear, with the exception of South Carolina, it is legal in every colony to teach blacks to read and write in this year of our Lord, 1762. Well, the reason being, do you know why it was banned in Carolina? I should be clear, there are slave code laws in any colony that you go to, from New England to Georgia. Georgia being the latest, since actually they did not allow slaves in until the 1750s. In any case, slave code laws are very different from colony to colony, especially after discussing this with my trustee. And I have also discovered, just from observation, they are never proactive. They are always reactive. So unless something has happened that would warrant something being banned, They don't ban it. That's exactly why in Carolina they banned writing. There was a rebellion there, how many years ago was it now? Almost 30. The Stono Rebellion? You familiar with it? In which a group of slaves rose up, killed whites, and were passing through Carolina using writing to continue with the uprising. So the next year later, after the rebellion was quelled, they banned writing. But I discover, though, with laws that there are always loopholes. I mentioned they banned writing. What did they not ban?
Reading.
Exactly. And when you have an official church, like the Church of England, being so powerful in Carolina, there's actually a school down there just now for slaves that only teaches reading, not writing. I would say, though, madam, if you wished a further explanation beyond my scope, if you waited about 5 minutes, I could give you an even more succinct answer. Does this assist you? Excellent. Were there any other curiosities or questions? Yes.
If you were to design your own lesson for your students, what would you choose to teach them?
Oh, I must apologize. I suppose I've not been clear. For the most part, I would use much of the same principles. I have no issue with the institution of slavery. I want to be very clear about that. No, they wouldn't let me teach at the school. And furthermore, I wouldn't have a job. If we did not have the institution of slavery, they wouldn't allow a school to exist like mine. I'd like to see some more Church of England documents there, but I'd also like to see them there for longer, and that's how I change the curriculum. As my students are slaves, 9 out of 10 of them, and slaves are considered property. Most specifically, if you want to get into logistics, they're considered real estate, not chattel goods. I cannot tell someone else what they may do with their property. So my students, I mentioned the attendance issue. I'm supposed to have them 3 years, but I usually get them for 12 months, and I cannot contradict a master or mistress. It is their property. So I think the biggest thing I'd change about my curriculum was that we'd have longer amounts of time with the students, but not materials. I hope this answers your question. Yes?
What is your favorite book?
My favorite book? Secular or sacred? What I mean to say is from a spiritual perspective or a secular's perspective?
Secular.
Secular. Adventures of Telemachus. Have you ever heard of that book? Oh, I'm so sorry. Very, very popular book, especially in Williamsburg now, especially for children and for women. Although, truth be told, a great number of men have read it. How do I explain it? Are you all familiar with Odysseus, the story of the Odyssey? His son, in the Greek, translated to later Latin, you have Odysseus to Ulysses and his son Telemachus. And Telemachus is mentioned in the journey as searching for his father, but there's not much of a story behind him. And in the latter part of the last century, the tutor to the Duke of Burgundy, the future French king, his brother, wrote this book. It was extremely controversial at the time. In fact, it was not till years after he was dead that his name was affixed to the title. But it is all about Telemachus searching for his father, Ulysses. And what I like about the book, 2 things I like about it. How familiar are you with Greek and Roman mythology? Vaguely? Are you all familiar with Minerva, the goddess of wisdom? My favorite part of this book must be, young lady, that Minerva guides Telemachus on his journey. Female goddess of wisdom, disguises herself as a man, known as Mentor, from whence the name derives, and teaches him along his way as he meets Calypso and goddesses of the sea and nymphs of the water and demons and devils. He teaches him what it means to be a good person. And I think that is why I like the book so much. It's fanciful and fantastic, but it also has a good lesson in it, to teach all people what it means on your journey to be a good person. So that's my favorite book. Were there any other curiosities? Well, then, if that case, since I did not wish to leave you, perhaps, in the dark, I have the great honor to speak to you as Mrs. Wager, and it has been quite a delight to speak to you for this past half hour. You've been very patient. But if we are being entirely honest, you're all very astute, and you know that Anne Wager's been dead for 250 years. And in this program, I do have the opportunity, especially with this content, to step out of character and speak as myself. So I wanted to take a minute actually to introduce myself, because Ann Wager and Nicole Brown are very different people
Yes.
for a lot of reasons. So my name is Nicole Brown. I am a nation builder for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and it is my delight and my frustration and sometimes my extreme challenge, but above all my honor, to portray somebody as contradictory and controversial as Ann Wager with a school that is equally contradictory and controversial. Which ties into your question of, I thought teaching any person of color to read or write was illegal in the colonial South. Trust me, I went through the same question, because when I got hired, they said that the 4 main topics we want you to talk about are women's history, education, religion, and slavery, and how they're all connected. So no pressure. And when I was hired, I went into research for 7 months at 8 to 10 hours a day, researching every day to be prepared for this. And on average, actually, in a week, especially in January, I would say about 38 of my hours this week were spent in reading master's theses and working on a paper. In any case, your question is a valid one of when did reading and writing become illegal? Because we know it did. And in Virginia, it's a really interesting story. In fact, for most of the colonial South, it is. When we talk about literacy and religion and education and race, what you're seeing traditionally over time is that slave code laws are reactive, not proactive. And unfortunately, the dominant white population at this point in time, they're doing 2 things. One, they believe that education, if they can fund it, and a lot of the large institutions are religiously based, are like, well, we're going to teach them to make them more obedient to the official church. But within that methodology, 2, any person of color doesn't learn the same way I as a white person do. They just repeat what they're told, which is the dominant belief at this time. I know it's a surprise to no one here. That was incorrect. And so when all of a sudden the American Revolution happens, and it's a revolution of ideas and politics and economy and religion, and we have the Second Great Awakening, and all of a sudden people can worship however they want, you see the ramifications of a lot of schools like the Bray schools in colonial America. All of a sudden these people have education, and they can read the Bible however they want. They can interpret the Bible however they want. They can use the Bible to interpret that they might be entitled to freedom. And all of a sudden, the population realizes, oh, wait a minute, now that we don't have any religious restrictions on the population, ooh, this might be a problem. So they get rid of what they perceive as the symptom. I can't get rid of religion, I can get rid of literacy. And actually, in Virginia, it was not officially illegal to educate a person of color until 1831. What happens in 1831? Does anyone know?
Nat Turner rules.
Exactly. And in fact, on the books, just 2 months before Nat Turner's rebellion, where this enslaved man who feels he is called by God and his knowledge of the Bible through his literacy to rebel, 2 months before this happens on the books, they say, well, now everything's off limits. They almost see it coming. It's a much longer process than that. They slowly start restricting things after 1808. And Gabriel Prosser's rebellion in the early 1800s, which was in Richmond, a failed slave uprising. But in Virginia, it's not officially illegal until 1831, and it's because it takes 40, 50 years for all of these ideas on religion and education and perspective and freedom to come to a breaking point. And at that point, the laws become reactive to literacy.
Because I came in thinking that you'd be someone who would, thought that the young Negro child deserved, and I use the word Negro because that would have been used at that
Right.
time.
So
Deserved it, but you're just the opposite.
Exactly.
You did it for the master
And
rather
this is-
than for the slave.
Yeah, and this is what is so controversial about this role. Because understandably, ma'am, I came to that the same way. I remember when I looked at the job posting and I was like, okay, a school for African Americans that's legal, but it isn't abolitionist? And I remember looking at the posting 4 or 5 times being like, wait a minute, this contradicts everything I've ever been taught in a classroom. And so that's part of the challenge of this role, is to get people to understand how education and literacy and religion were all connected, and then from there to get people to understand how complex it really was. So I hope I answered your question.
You did.
Yeah.
You threw me. Well, blacks at that time.
Yeah.
You said we're property
But they were chattel and not, and
No,
they
they
were not
were-
chattel, they
they
were
were
talking
real
real
estate.
estate.
Yeah.
How
How does that work?
legally-
Right. So when most people talk about enslaved individuals and the law and how they define them under law, they think they're chattel property, right? And by chattel property, just so that we're all on the same page, there's real property and personal property. Personal property is something in the 18th century like silver, a horse, a chair. And unfortunately, very often enslaved individuals are referred to as such, but not legally. The reason for that has to do with the plantation breakdown. So we were talking in the program about how most people live on plantations. And very often, and women are very both culpable and very active in the legal system when it comes to enslaved bodies. Because often wealthy families who are trying to keep properties together try to suit up not only love matches, but legally beneficial and financially beneficial matches. And so often in a marriage, a man will bring land and a woman will bring slaves. And because they want to keep the land and the enslaved individuals together, they don't want the woman's property to be personal property. They want it to be real estate. Because then it's attached to the land with how laws relate to white English women. So under law, white English women do have rights. They have the right to hold property in Virginia. They have the right to petition the government. They have the right to representation. And under the dower system, the legal system, women, so I should be clear about this, dowry is what you bring into a marriage, and not to be trite, dower is what you get out of it if your husband dies before you. So dowry, usually you bring in slaves. It's a little bit different with dower unless you have a prenuptial contract, which you do see in 18th century women. But dower, for a woman whose husband dies intestate without a will, automatically means she gets 1/3 of the real estate to use during her lifetime, and 1/3 of the personal property that she can do anything she wants with. And all of a sudden, when people realized that personal property might include enslaved individuals that would pull them away from the land, they transferred them to real estate. Now, when we move into the American Democratic Republic, that law changes. And in fact, early on, I don't know as much about the 19th century, but early on, enslaved individuals are considered real estate for women and personal property for men. Just let you think about that for a minute. Yeah. But ultimately, at its core, that's what's going on in a colonial world that is agrarian in nature. And it changes over time, but at least at this point in time when you're meeting Ann Wager, that's actually how they're defining it. So you also hit on a topic I'm really interested in, which is law, because it's very malleable, much more malleable than you think, both in history and now. And a lot of things change based on what person is in power to dictate what can happen or cannot happen. So I hope that answers your question. I know we are at the end of our time, so I actually wanted to say two things. One, thank you. I was literally delighted that in January, when we usually have no people, that there's a full room of people in here. Seriously, I'm really excited, thank you. And to that point, that's also why I want to thank you. Because my job is meaningful and I care about it, but it only matters if you're willing to engage. And if you're willing to engage on really difficult topics that make everybody uncomfortable, then that makes my job doubly meaningful. So thank you for your time. If you have any other questions, you can come up and ask them, but mostly I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.